The anime begins by showing Rentt Faina, an adventurer who always goes to the guild headquarters in the morning to get the best missions for ranking up. Unfortunately, even though he has been an adventurer for a long time, Rentt is still in the bronze class, the second lowest class, which only allows him to take on certain missions according to his level. Apparently, Rentt doesn't seem to mind this because he only wants to hunt monsters to get money from selling the items he finds to meet his daily needs. One day, Rentt, who was on a mission in the moon's reflection labyrinth, discovered a new path that no one had ever ventured before. Hoping to gain more rewards, Rentt decided to enter it, but he ended up encountering a dragon monster that eventually killed him. When Rentt regained consciousness, he had become an undead skeleton at the edge of a lake inside the labyrinth, which made Rentt panic because he couldn't possibly return to the city in that condition. While wandering around the labyrinth, a skeleton monster confronted him, and Rentt tried to defeat the monster even though he initially had difficulty lifting his sword in his skeleton state. Fortunately, Rentt managed to defeat the skeleton monster, which then emitted a light and gave him a recovery effect. Rentt remembered his friend, Lorraine Vivi's words, who had told him that monsters could evolve over time. Because of this, Rentt focused on exterminating more monsters to evolve faster until he became a ghoul, a monstrous humanoid with flesh, so that he could return to the city. On the other hand, at the guild headquarters, a newly registered novice adventurer named Rena Rupridge was choosing her mission. Sheila Abars, who is a staff member at the Adventurers Guild, suggested that Rena explore the moon's reflection labyrinth. Meanwhile, Rentt, who was still in the labyrinth, began to evolve into a ghoul, which made it easier for him to fight monsters. Additionally, his magical power and vitality also increased, making him stronger. Shortly afterward, Rentt heard Rena's screams as she was fighting a skeleton monster, and Rentt immediately approached to defeat the skeleton monster. Rena, seeing Rentt's still frightening appearance, stood ready with her sword until Rentt explained that he was not an enemy, but an adventurer trapped in the labyrinth. After Rena understood Rentt's situation, he asked Rena to buy him some clothes. With the money given by Rentt, she immediately went to the city to buy Rentt's requested items and then returned to the labyrinth. In addition to clothes, Rena also bought Rentt a mask, which turned out to be cursed, so when he put it on, the mask could not be removed. Rena then admitted that she regretted buying the mask, considering the mask seller was a bit suspicious. Nevertheless, Rentt did not blame Rena and intended to find a way to break the curse. With his new appearance, Rentt returned to the city with Rena, and upon reaching the city gate, she helped Rentt pass through the guard inspection. After that, Rentt immediately left Rena without saying anything and intended to meet her again once he had fully recovered. After that, Rentt decided to go to the home of Lorraine, a silver-class adventurer who was also a researcher and quite close to him. When Rentt arrived, Lorraine immediately asked what had happened to him. At that time, Rentt recounted everything that had happened, and Lorraine asked about his next plan. Rentt said he still wanted to be an adventurer, but he couldn't go to the guild headquarters and claimed to be Rentt in his current state. Lorraine, who had long had feelings for Rentt, then offered to let him stay at her house on the condition that Rentt had to help her with her research. Having no other choice, Rentt agreed to Lorraine's terms. The next day, Lorraine sold the magic stone found by Rentt so that he could use the money from the sale to repair his sword. On another occasion, Lorraine was busy reading literature to find clues about Rentt's condition. Eventually, she remembered how she first met Rentt. In the past, Lorraine found her life boring. Even when she earned the title of the youngest professor, she didn't feel happy at all. That's why Lorraine deliberately registered as a silver-class adventurer to alleviate her boredom. Until one day, Lorraine went on a mission with Rentt, which brought them closer together. Back in the present, Rentt visited an acquaintance, a blacksmith named Clope, to order a sword. Although Rentt did not reveal his true identity, Clope and his assistant, Luca, recognized him as Rentt, who was in some sort of trouble. Knowing this, Clope deliberately did not ask any questions to respect Rentt's privacy. After returning to Lorraine's house, Rentt prepared dinner for her, but Rentt did not join the meal as he did not feel hungry. Lorraine then read some literature and speculated that Rentt was not an ordinary undead, but possibly linked to existential evolution. Knowing this, Rentt was determined to achieve the next evolution so that he could appear more like a complete human. On another day, Rentt returned to the labyrinth to further his evolution, where he accidentally encountered a solo adventurer named Loris Cariello, who worked as a chef at a restaurant. Upon realizing that Rentt was a fairly strong adventurer, Loris decided to join him. Unfortunately, along the way, Loris fell into a trap that transported him to the boss dungeon room. Rentt couldn't ignore this and followed Loris to a room where he had to face a giant skeleton. To deal with the monster, Rentt channeled his power to strengthen his sword until he finally managed to decapitate the skeleton. After defeating the giant skeleton, Rentt immediately provided first aid to Loris, who had been injured by the giant skeleton's attack. At that time, Loris explained that he was the owner of a nearly bankrupt restaurant and had decided to become an adventurer to obtain items to pay off his debts. To help him, Rentt gave the magic stone he had obtained after defeating the giant skeleton to Loris on the condition that he would help Rentt gain access to restaurants and the Adventurers Guild. Hearing this, Loris agreed as it gave him the opportunity to revive his business. After that, Rentt escorted Loris home and met his wife, Isabel, who thanked Rentt after learning that her husband had received much help from him. Upon returning home, Rentt realized that something was wrong with him, and when he met Lorraine, he suddenly bit her shoulder. Despite this, Lorraine remained calm and used her magical powers to soothe Rentt. After regained his consciousness, Rentt apologized and healed Lorraine's wound with his power. Shortly after her wound was healed, Lorraine realized that Rentt's body was becoming more like a normal human body, leading Lorraine to assume that his body had evolved after drinking her blood. To confirm her suspicion, Lorraine intended to make Rentt the subject of her research. Without wasting any time, Lorraine administered a deadly poison and a medicinal potion. Strangely, Rentt did not react at all after drinking the poison, but he experienced pain from drinking Lorraine's potion. After conducting various experiments, Lorraine inquired about Rentt's appetite, which showed that he only desired to eat human flesh and blood. Because of this, Lorraine gave Rentt a bottle of her blood for him to drink. Not long after, Rentt planned to explore the labyrinth again, so Lorraine suggested that he register as a new adventurer to avoid any issues. Rentt followed Lorraine's advice and immediately went to the Adventurers Guild headquarters to register as an adventurer under a new name. After registering as an adventurer, Rentt began his mission in the labyrinth to explore areas that other adventurers had not yet reached. While passing through the boss monster's room, Rentt accidentally entered a strange room that looked like someone's living quarters. Shortly after, a mysterious woman appeared, asking why Rentt had entered the room. Although he claimed he was just exploring the labyrinth, the mysterious woman did not believe him and thought Rentt was there to loot, so she attacked him, tearing his clothes. Upon seeing the condition of Rentt's body, the mysterious woman immediately apologized and even treated him kindly by giving Rentt her cloak and the acacia map. Before leaving, the mysterious woman asked Rentt not to tell anyone about the map he had received. When Rentt returned to Lorraine's house, he showed the items he had obtained in the labyrinth, and Lorraine was surprised to learn that he had acquired a map that could chart every labyrinth he had ever entered. Additionally, the mysterious woman's cloak was found to be much stronger than iron armor. The next day, Rentt planned to meet the woman again, but he couldn't find her because the path to the mysterious room had disappeared. On another occasion, Rentt met with Sheila to take on a mission to hunt orcs. Sheila initially forbade him because of his low level, but after Rentt managed to convince Sheila that he was already accustomed to facing orcs, she allowed him to take the mission. In a short time, Rentt successfully completed the mission and returned to the guild headquarters with several pieces of orc meat. With the success of that mission, Rentt received an invitation to participate in the bronze class promotion exam for adventurers. When he returned home, Rentt told Lorraine about the invitation for the adventurer class promotion. Lorraine wasn't very surprised, given Rentt's long-standing skills as an adventurer. At that time, Lorraine was curious about the name Rentt used when registering as a new adventurer. But Rentt admitted to using her family name because Rentt didn't want any bad rumors about her, especially since Rentt often went in and out of her house. Hearing this explanation, Lorraine seemed pleased that Rentt considered her, even though she was never concerned about her reputation. The next day, Rentt went to the Adventurers Guild headquarters to take the Adventurer class promotion exam. In the exam, Rentt appeared to complete all the stages of the first test easily, and he even managed to achieve a perfect score. In the next test, Rentt had to form a team and complete a mission prepared by the Adventurers Guild. In the team assignments conducted by the guild, Rentt was grouped with a swordsman named Rayeyes Dunner and a female mage named Seishii. Apparently, the mission they had to complete was to reach a designated location within the labyrinth. and the team that arrived at the destination earlier than the other teams would be considered the winner and receive a prize. While the other teams began entering the labyrinth, Rentt remained calm and decided to buy the latest labyrinth map, as the map provided by the Adventurers Guild was outdated. At that time, Rei seemed to dislike Rentt constantly giving advice to their team, but after he saw firsthand Rentt's strength in defeating monsters, Rei agreed to follow all of his instructions. With all the experience that Rentt had, his team was the first to reach the door of the boss monster's room. Not long after, another participant group intended to enter the room to claim the main prize. In this situation, Rentt allowed that team to enter first, showing his teammates that avoiding unnecessary fights was not shameful. As Rentt predicted, the previous team failed to defeat the boss monster, so Rentt's team entered the room intending to defeat the boss monster. Although the participants were not actually required to defeat the boss monster, Rei and Seishii decided to fight it to become true adventurers. Upon entering the room, they found themselves facing a giant slime monster that was immune to the adventurers' physical attacks. Knowing this, Rentt asked Seishii to prepare fire magic, while Rei tried to distract the monster. When Rei started to struggle, Rentt stepped in to fight the monster until Seishii managed to unleash her fire magic, which allowed them to defeat the slime monster. After that, Rentt suggested that Rei and Seishii collect the slime's liquid, as it had a high market value. After completing all the missions, Rentt and the others continued their journey back, and along the way, Rentt took the time to show them an area inside the labyrinth that was a forest. Rei expressed a desire to explore it, but Rentt did not allow it, reminding them that their main goal was to complete the guild's mission. Shortly after, Rentt and his team successfully completed the mission, leading all three of them to pass the exam and become silver-class adventurers. On another occasion, Sheila approached Rentt and said she wanted to ask him something. Seeing her behavior, Rentt realized that Sheila had discovered his true identity. Once they were in a private room, Sheila asked Rentt to explain what had happened to him. Without hesitation, Rentt revealed that he had become a monster, but Sheila did not seem frightened. Instead, she intended to help Rentt so he could carry out various missions without arousing suspicion from others. That night, Rentt went home to Lorraine's house with Sheila, who wanted to discuss his condition with Lorraine. Although Lorraine initially did not like Sheila's arrival, she accepted her as her guest after seeing Sheila's sincerity in wanting to help Rentt. At that time, Sheila informed them that lately there had been many cases of missing adventurers, and Rentt's conspicuous appearance made him a suspect in the kidnappings of these adventurers. To reduce suspicion against him, Rentt decided not to take on any missions for the next few days. Even though he was on a break, Rentt kept himself busy with Clope to pick up the sword he had previously ordered. Upon arriving at Clope's place, Rentt immediately tried out his sword, and with his ever-increasing abilities, each slash of his sword could split the wood in front of him. During the trial, Rentt also attempted to combine all his techniques into a single sword slash. Unfortunately, this caused the sword to shatter into dust as it couldn't withstand his immense power. After that, Rentt said goodbye to Clope, and on his way back, he saw a young man asking for help from an adventurer. Unfortunately, the adventurer refused to help, stating that he only took on missions from the Adventurers Guild. Feeling pity, Rentt decided to help the young man named Ryantis. Without wasting any time, Ryantis explained that his younger sister, Amiris, was to be sacrificed in the village of Tatsu's ritual, so he asked Rentt to save her. Rentt then followed Ryantis back to his village, and upon arriving in Tatsu, Rentt began to sense something strange as the village seemed too quiet. After Rentt met Amiris, he also noticed that the girl didn't seem afraid. She even admitted that she didn't mind being sacrificed in the village's long-standing tradition. Because of this, Amiris asked Rentt to leave and cancel his mission, but he refused unless Ryantis canceled it. The next day, Rentt wandered around the village until he met a group of merchants from outside the village. Although the villagers didn't suspect these merchants who were always helping them, Rentt found it strange that the merchants only came at certain times. Before Amiris was to be sacrificed, Rentt managed to meet her and asked Amiris to keep fighting as he and Ryantis would save her. That night, Amiris boarded a boat to the middle of the lake, which suddenly became covered in fog. Shortly thereafter, a monster that unleashed a fire attack appeared, forcing Rentt to confront the monster. During the fight, Rentt realized that it was all an illusion spell because, behind the fog, the villains disguised as village merchants had been waiting to kidnap Amiris. Knowing this, Rentt quickly captured all the villains on the boat and rescued Amiris along with all the other victims kidnapped by the gang. On another day, Rentt intended to take on a mission to collect dragon blood flowers, which are known to be very rare. According to Sheila, many adventurers refuse this mission because it is difficult and the pay is low. Nevertheless, Rentt was determined to complete the mission, so he went to the orphanage to meet the person who posted the mission. Upon arriving at the orphanage, Rentt met a young girl named Alize, who then explained that she had secretly posted the mission to the Adventurers Guild to find a cure for her caregiver, Lillian Jun, who was suffering from a rare disease that could only be cured with dragon blood flowers. After hearing Alize's explanation, Rentt decided to take on the mission and would soon head to the toxic swamp to obtain the dragon blood flowers. Before his departure, Rentt also took the time to help Alize clean the orphanage basement. During this time, Rentt was accidentally bitten by a rat, but due to the undead blood in his body, the rat turned into a vampire minion of him. That night, Rentt returned to Lorraine's house and, unusually, he was able to enjoy human food because Lorraine had secretly mixed her blood into the food. In the following days, Rentt went to the toxic swamp with the mouse to complete Alize's mission. With his body that immune to various poisons, which allowed Rentt to enter the swamp easily. Unfortunately, Rentt had to face many monsters to reach the location of the dragon blood flowers. He even fought the Tarrasque dragon that guarded the swamp. Fortunately, with the help of his vampire mouse minion, Rentt managed to defeat the dragon. Rentt then continued his journey to collect the flowers he sought. Upon reaching the field of dragon blood flowers, Rentt accidentally encountered an elf named Isaac Hart, who was also picking dragon blood flowers for his ill master. The two of them had a conversation in which Isaac mentioned that he was looking for an adventurer to regularly pick dragon blood flowers on his behalf. Seeing that Rentt had successfully reached the place, Isaac realized that Rentt's abilities were quite strong, so he offered the job to him. Rentt then expressed his interest in Isaac's job offer. Sometime later, Rentt returned to the Adventurers Guild headquarters to report on his successfully completed mission. Afterward, Rentt quietly took the Tarrasque dragon he had defeated to Dario, the guild's monster butcher, because Rentt didn't want to draw attention after killing a dragon known to be difficult to defeat. The next morning, Rentt delivered the dragon blood flowers he had obtained to the orphanage, where Alize handed them over to a potion maker so that the flowers could be turned into medicine for Lillian. Alize then thanked Rentt for helping her, and she also admitted to being more motivated to become an adventurer when she grows up. Rentt was pleased to see Alize's enthusiasm and offered to help her achieve her dream. On another day, Rentt visited the Adventurers Guild headquarters to meet with Sheila, who informed him that he had received a letter from the Latour family, giving him a special mission. Sheila explained that the Latour family had been around for a long time and were often involved in state affairs, so she was concerned that if Rentt's identity was revealed, he would face punishment from the family. Nevertheless, Rentt did not intend to refuse the mission and quickly went to the Latour residence. Upon arriving at the gate, Rentt had to pass through a labyrinth to reach the main door. A guard then reminded Rentt not to follow the direction of the sunlight while traversing the labyrinth. After hearing the guard's explanation, Rentt confidently entered the labyrinth and arrived at a gazebo where a girl was sitting and enjoying her tea. Rentt immediately assumed that the girl he met was the daughter of the Latour family, who liked to collect magical artifacts. The girl, named Laura, was even interested in the magical mask Rentt was wearing, but he said he couldn't sell it, even if offered a high price. After having tea with Laura, Rentt continued his journey through the labyrinth. Laura then gave him the same advice as the guard at the entrance, not to follow the sunlight. Unfortunately, Rentt did not heed the warning and followed the sunlight, which led him back to the starting point, forcing him to start over. Fortunately, Rentt managed to exit the labyrinth before dark and met Laura, who introduced herself as the head of the Latour family. With Rentt's successful exit from the labyrinth, Laura said she would give him a magical item from her collection as a reward. Together with Isaac, Laura invited Rentt into the room where various magical items were stored, and Laura asked Rentt to choose the magical item he desired. While selecting, Rentt accidentally touched and activated a golem, prompting Laura to quickly instruct Isaac to find the golem's deactivation device. At the same time, Rentt tried to fend off the golem's rampage, but his attacks had no effect on the golem. Fortunately, Isaac quickly found the deactivation device, allowing them to neutralize the golem. Even though the room was in ruins, Laura did not seem to mind and asked Rentt to continue searching for the reward he wanted. After looking around, Rentt eventually chose a bottle containing vampire blood that could turn someone into a vampire. When he got home, Rentt showed the vampire blood he had acquired. Lorraine, upon seeing it, informed him that, according to records, most people who drank it went mad, and some even died. Due to the high risk, Lorraine forbade Rentt from drinking it, but he insisted on drinking it in hopes that his body could return to normal and he could continue his dream of becoming a mithril-class adventurer. Lorraine was curious about why Rentt wanted to become a high-ranking adventurer, and Rentt confessed that, in the past, he had a friend named Jean Lin who always protected him. One day, while they were on their way back to their village, they were suddenly ambushed by a monster. Rentt and Jean Lin tried to escape from the monster, but eventually, Jean Lin decided to sacrifice herself to protect Rentt. Shortly afterward, an adventurer named Wilfried Ryucker came and drove off the monster that was about to attack Rentt. Since that incident, Rentt had been determined to become a mithril-class adventurer like Wilfried. Back in the present, after hearing Rentt's story, Lorraine finally understood and allowed him to drink the vampire blood, even though it caused him great pain. A few days later, it showed that all the townspeople were going about their usual activities, like Clope, who was busy making a stronger sword for Rentt, and Alize, who looked happy after seeing that Lillian was starting to recover. Adventurers were also gathered at the Adventurers Guild to find missions. Meanwhile, after several days of unconsciousness, Rentt finally woke up with a human appearance. Lorraine then informed him that he had successfully become a vampire, as he had desired, although his magical mask still couldn't be removed. At that moment, Rentt said he planned to meet Wilfried once he reached mithril class. Hearing this, Lorraine said she would always support all of Rentt's dreams. Moral lesson from the story: even if you end up as a skeleton in a labyrinth, remember, buying cursed masks from shady merchants isn't the best way to improve your life. Keep hunting monsters, and someday you'll evolve into a ghoul with a pretty decent wardrobe.